Content warning. The following video contains description of slavery and general desperation that some viewers may find it hard to listen to. I want to tell you a story. This is the story of a slave. This slave is of the dirt. His mother is of the dirt. His father is of the dirt. He was raised to till the land in service of his Lord. He likes his Lord. While he and his family must toil hard, the Lord who owns their labor is kind. When he was a small boy, the Lord would bring apples, beautiful apples that grew on trees from behind his castle walls, and toss one to the boy without asking anything in return, and he would offer the boy a soft smile. His mother labored away on turning the milk from the cows into cheese. His father worked in the fields with sweat rolling off of his back to till in the harvest. The boy would not grow to receive an education. His school would be the school of the dirt. He would follow in his father's footsteps to work the fields. Had his parents birthed a girl instead, she would follow in his mother's footsteps, learning to work the cattle and make sure that they produce good milk. When the boy turned 14, the Lord became very sick, and despite the doctor's best leeches and herbal remedies, he was not able to recover. The boy, his parents, and the land in which they were bound to was sold off to a new lord. The new lord did not bring the boy apples from within the castle. Within a year, the new lord was in a conflict with the neighboring lord. Each lord would gather up their serfs and their freemen and sent them to battle. The boy was not old enough to go to war, but his father, despite being sickly, was. The boy's father went to battle for the new lord and never returned. The boy was never sure why the two lords were in conflict in the first place. In truth, the conflict was based on a minor land dispute. The new lord, having just purchased his new estate, believed that his territory ran about a mile further west than it actually did. And for this, he waged a battle against his neighbor. Regardless, their new lord had need of them, and it was not their place to question their lord. Now, with his father gone, the boy is now considered a man, and must take to work the fields himself. He hopes to soon marry a girl from the neighboring farm. They haven't spoke much before, but she's fair to look at, so he plans to ask the Lord for permission to marry. He saw no reason why the Lord would refuse, and regardless of her intents or her desires, they would be married. This was his life. This was the life of a serf under feudalism. He knew deep down that he wasn't content, that he wasn't happy with the way things were. But he also knew that it wasn't his place to ask questions. The Lord had been placed there by God, and he was placed in the dirt by God. This was the way of things. This was his purpose. He knew this is all he would ever be. He knew he did not have the freedom to be anything else. I want to tell you a story. This is the story of a slave. She had watched her eldest son be ripped from her arms before his 10th year. He was big for his age, and would grow to be a more than capable worker, and would fetch a good price at auction. She had seen her second-born carted off in the middle of the night, not long after his 13th birthday. Her husband and her brother had been sold off not long after her second son had been born. She remained. It had become useless to keep track of how many of her friends and family had been sold off over the years, traded away like cattle. All she had left was her youngest sister and her lucky cousin, who, from a young age, was allowed to work in the big house, cooking and cleaning for the master and his family. From time to time, while toiling away in the tobacco fields under the cruel weight of the Louisiana summer sun, she would catch a glimpse of her cousin, whom she had known since birth. Those beautiful brown eyes, once full of life, were now sunken and black, full of sadness. She noticed how her cousin cowered any time the master came near. She had been born to this life. From the time she was deemed able-bodied to work at the age of 8, she had spent her days, from the dawn until dusk, toiling away in the fields. She was good at it. Her mother always told her, as long as she did what she was told, she behaved, and she worked hard, she would be okay. Her youngest brother never listened to their mother too well. He was sickly and weaker than her. She remembers the first time that he got whipped for failing to do his duties. The scars were so angry and terrible she could barely bear to look at him. The second time was even worse than that, and the third... well, he didn't make it after the third time. One day, the master brought in a new load of slaves. One man, a tall slave, took a liking to her. The tall man came from a cotton plantation to the east, but she noticed that any time the masters were nearby, the master, the missus, even their children, the tall man's eyes filled with rage and hatred. One night she asked him why, and he told her that they were never meant to be slaves, that they should be free, and that no man had the right to abuse them the way the masters did. He suggested to her that they could run away to the north, that he had family who'd escaped up there. She knew it was crazy talk, but over time, it started to weigh on her. These fantasies began to feel more and more real. Suddenly, the tall man began talking with the others, and they formed a plan to sneak away in the night and make for the north. It made her feel so afraid. She thought of her brother, her sons, her father, all of her friends, all either dead or sold off to some other master. She wondered how long it would be until it was her turn. She decided to make a go for it with the tall man and the others, to make a run for freedom. She desperately tried to convince her younger sister to come with them, but she was too afraid. And so, they ran. But they didn't make it far. Only a day later, slave catchers had caught up with them in the woods. The night of their escape, another slave had caught wind of their plans and told the masters. When they got back, the master had them whipped raw. The tall man, whose voice could sing her such lovely melodies, was hung from a tree and his body set to fire. She would never forget the smell of his burning flesh, or the sight of the master's children being gifted his burnt fingers as a trophy. A few weeks later, she was sitting in a cage at auction, waiting to be sold off to a new master. The scent of the tall man still lingered in her nose. This was her fate. She was property first and foremost, and most of these masters wouldn't even dare to consider her human. She would not be allowed the joys of love, family, life, and freedom. A rich white family would be free to beat her, to rape her, to rip her children from her arms, and to trade her away like cattle. This is what it meant to be a slave. And she knew she did not have the freedom to be anything else. I want to tell you a story. This is the story of a slave. But this slave is different from the others. She was given an opportunity to earn an education. From ages 4 through 16, she showed up every single day on time. She didn't care that her clothes were baggy or stained because they had been given to her from her older cousin. She wasn't the smartest in her class, but she always managed to usually get around a B+. She worked hard. She would come home to a double-wide trailer, a mangy little mutt who was always happy to see her, a younger brother who was always obsessed with the latest comic book, and a father who was always so angry. He was angry because of the abuse of his toil and the exploitation of his labor. He was angry because of how little he was given for as much as was required. But the father didn't know why he was angry. He just knew that he was angry. Her mother had taken to working nights at the local diner. The daughter was pretty sure that her mother had been sleeping with the diner's manager for extra tips. But the daughter wasn't angry. She understood. Her father's rage had become so toxic lately that it drove everyone around him further away. One day, she had come home and was discussing college opportunities that had been being showcased at her school with her mother. She was so excited looking at the different potential colleges. Even a small local college would have been the first in her family. Her father stormed in, enraged. He was so mad, and he even kind of knew why this time. He was mad because no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much sweat he poured, no matter how much he bled for the company that he worked at, he would never earn enough in order to afford paying for a roof over their heads and her to go to college. He knew this, but it didn't stop him from taking his rage out on her. It didn't stop him from throwing her laptop against the wall. It didn't stop him from taking his hands to her mother. And when she protested, it didn't stop him from slapping her. 3 years later, she was working a register at the fast food joint, selling burgers and fries. She was no longer concerned with trivial things like going to college. No, now she had to focus on more practical goals, like making rent, making sure her electricity stayed on, making sure she had a way to get to work. Her period was now 3 weeks late. She was petrified. The father was a good man. He worked 2 jobs, same as her, and when they had the spare time, they would spend it with each other to keep each other company. But now, she knew that she did not have the time or money to take care of a child. When she told the father, he was ecstatic, petrified, but ecstatic. He assured her that he would do everything he could to take care of her and provide for the babies, give them the life that they needed. Abortion wasn't an option. She was 3 hours away from the nearest clinic, and she didn't have the time, resources, or transportation to go that far. She also didn't have insurance. Despite working 2 jobs, both employers kept her at less than 36 hours a week so that she didn't get full-time benefits like health insurance. Her only option was to move in with the father. And while she wasn't absolutely in love with him, she did care for him. And he did for her. She knew she didn't have the freedom to do anything else. 10 years later, she'd had twins, a boy and a girl. She spent her nights working at the local diner because she could no longer stand to be around their father. No matter how hard she seemed to toil, no matter how hard she worked, nothing she could do ever seemed to be able to raise herself or her family out of their circumstances. She had always been told that if she kept her head down, worked hard, and did what she was told, she would go far. But in real life, promotions always seemed to go to the younger, the prettier, or the men. She was a slave, not in name or in trade, but she was bound to the wheel of capitalism. She was a slave to poverty. Like so many others, she was promised the lie of opportunity, yet the options afforded to her were always too few. She is of every race, every gender, and every creed. The wages she earns working 70+ hours a week will never be enough to cover all of her basic needs. And so she toils on, selling her body to wealthy kings in exchange for a wage. A wage is not a real thing. It is a representation of a thing. Today, we live under the reign of wealthy kings. CEOs, hedge fund managers, stockbrokers, lobbyists, politicians, and they all tell us the same thing. That we must earn our living. That we must earn our right to live. None of us are simply allowed to simply be or to exist. They have convinced us that in order to live, we must earn a wage, that this wage is the thing that we need to survive. They have convinced us that this is all we deserve. All must toil and labor for the new kings. Those who cannot are allowed to sleep on the street so long as they don't encroach on any park benches. And should the weather turn hostile, well, no one cares if a homeless man who no one knows the name of dies in the streets. In the United States, every single year, 13,000 people die from homelessness. 45,000 die because they do not have access to simple, basic health coverage. And that is not to say anything of the millions more who suffer permanent damage to their health because they leave illnesses and conditions to go unchecked because they cannot afford to have it examined. And so they create lifelong disabilities simply because they cannot afford basic health care. Every year, 9 million people die worldwide from hunger, despite the fact that we have more than enough food to feed every single one of them a time over. 14 million people die every year in ways that could be prevented were it not for capitalism. All of this is avoidable. Last year, nearly half of my country lost their jobs. Millions more experienced cut hours and wages so that they could barely afford to make rent. And all that any of us were given to survive was a measly $1,800 for an entire year. Meanwhile, our wealthy kings took advantage of the pandemic and all the misfortune across our nation and across our globe to gift themselves billions and billions more dollars. In 2020, the average rent was $1,468. This means that you would have had to have earned $6,000 a month, or just over $70,000 a year, in order to meet the recommended ratio of 1:4 for your rent to income. Even before the pandemic and half the country lost their jobs, in 2018, over 50% of the households in the US did not meet this criteria. The current poverty line in the US for a family of 4 is currently set at $26,167, which frankly I find absurdly low. But even given that, 1 out of 10 households don't even meet this. That is 34 million Americans living in extreme poverty. And all of this is just what occurs to those of us living in the system that the system is actively trying to convince us that we're free. What about the prisoners? In the US, the 13th Amendment specifically is worded so that slavery is legal so long as that slavery is performed by the state through the use of prison labor. This could lead you to believe that prison labor is almost exclusively done for things like cleaning up highways. But you'd be incorrect. The US sells prison labor to massive corporations all the time, and these corporations use them to drive down cost. Wendy's, McDonald's, Walmart, Starbucks, JCPenney, Kmart, Verizon, Sprint, Fidelity Investments, and Victoria's Secret, as well as being used to make 100% of all military helmets and 90% of the service assembly industry is used with prison labor. Prison laborers assemble everything in the US, from paintbrushes to kitchen appliances to speakers. We know that nearly 2.5 million people in the US are currently in prison, representing nearly 1 out of 10 adult citizens. Of that population, over half of them are in prison for nonviolent drug offenses or other nonviolent crimes. This means that the US has an explicit policy of arresting its citizens for minor crimes, throwing them in prison and stripping them of their freedoms, and then selling them into slavery against the major corporations who pull the strings. Well, how much do these prisoners get paid? Somewhere between 90 cents and $4 a day. And that's just in America. That's the stuff we can see right in front of us. We all know that these massive corporations, as soon as they have the opportunity, will take their production overseas and use underpaid labor to help drive down their costs. And it's not just adults that these corporations are exploiting. No, they exploit everyone, especially the children. Worldwide, the child labor that we made illegal in the United States and other developed nations is considered common practice in the poor nations. And it's not because they don't know any better, and it's not because they don't want their children to have education and to not be exploited in dangerous situations, but it's because capitalists intentionally keep these countries in poverty so that they may exploit them in order to make profits in the wealthy countries. Again, capitalism requires poverty, because without poverty, you're no longer desperate enough to need to be exploited by the capitalists. So, how many children are actually used for this labor? Does this really have an effect on me? The US Department of Labor has estimated that there are about 152 million children worldwide working in labor. Of that 152 million, 73 million are working in jobs that are considered life-endangering or hazardous. Everything from gold, jewelry, clothing, cattle, coffee, every major corner of the market has the blood of child labor on its hands. So who all is exploiting this child labor? Anyone you know? Let's see. Nestle, H&M, Philip Morris, Microsoft, Apple, Hershey's, Forever 21, Nike, of course, are just a few of the dozens of companies who have been caught willfully engaging in child labor. They taught us that capitalism ended slavery. They taught us that under capitalism we are free. They lied. Capitalism didn't take away our chains, it just rebranded them. This is the order of things. This is how the world works. Every generation of slave has always told themselves this was all they would ever have. Every generation of slave told themselves this was all they needed, all they ever deserved. This freedom was enough. But eventually, every generation of slaves looked around and said, enough. So ask yourself, would you have been satisfied as a serf working for a feudal lord? Would you have been satisfied under the whip and chain of a plantation? So why do you think it's okay to be satisfied now? Hey guys, thank you so much for watching the video. I took a different approach this week. I wanted to focus less on theory and focus specifically on something that I see as a major issue that we're all facing in the world today. Wage slavery is something that does not get talked about enough. Now, I want to make sure I clarify. I am not trying to equate the living conditions of those living as a wage slave to the previous generations of slaves and what they had to go through. It's not nearly the same. Conditions absolutely have improved. I'm merely trying to get us to examine what we believe slavery to be and ask ourselves if we truly find that we're free under capitalism under that same definition. I want to take a second to give a shout out to a good friend of mine, Tyrell. He's the one who wrote the plantation slavery section. I did not feel comfortable allowing myself to write and speak for African slaves when that's not my heritage. And I asked him if he would mind writing that section for me, and he did a beautiful job. I'm gonna take a second to plug him here. I'm gonna leave a link in the description. He's an artist, and he creates some really, really cool virtual art that I would just love for some of you guys to go check out and support him if you can. He's a great guy, great artist, and I really appreciated his help with this video. That's our show today. Thank you so much for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comment section. Please be sure to click like if you liked the video. If you didn't, you don't have to click the dislike button, but you can if you want to. Subscribe, ring the bell, and as always, be good to yourself, be good to each other, and don't let your life go unexamined.